All right, everybody, let's get started. So today we're going to finish the our talk on different types of discrimination and kind of how they connect with race and ethnicity, not just in the United States but also in the world, or at least get done with the theoretical component of things. We've looked at a couple of examples. We looked at discrepancies in positions of power in sports. We've looked at the origins of race. We've really looked at a lot of things kind of historically. And now what we're going to do is kind of finish up by looking at some of the overarching ways in which we see discrimination and prejudice kind of applied across societies. So you've seen this already. We've already looked at the frustration aggression hypothesis and the idea of scapegoating, as well as the idea of emphasizing conformity, right, the authoritarianism. But I wanted to start here because really these are the kind of theories or thought processes that we see societies or groups within societies use when they then commit acts of discrimination. All right, and when we look at those, there are a variety of different ways that we see this happen. So let's take a look. So what we look at here are really the major ways in which we see discrimination take place. So I just kind of want to quickly work through them. Genocide, we know what genocide is, right? The mass killing of a group based on, at least in this case, we're talking about race and ethnicity, but it can be on orientation, religious beliefs. Really, genocide can be perpetrated against any group if it's, a coordinated, sponsored, attack that is, singling out a particular characteristic of a group. But in this case, we know that racial and ethnic genocide is something that, unfortunately has happened all over the world. Whether we look at some of the more recent examples like Rwanda or in Bosnia, or going back like the Armenian genocide in the early 1900s. And there are many other examples. While it's the largest scale of these, it's the one that's probably the most straightforward to kind of understand what it is. Then we have individual discrimination. This kind of links in with the symbolic interactionist perspective, right? It's a micro level thing. One person on their own acting in a way that targets someone for their race or ethnicity in this case, right? The bigger one, and this is the one that takes a little more explaining, and we're going to look at some examples of this, is what's called institutionalized discrimination. And the thing that makes this different is that institutionalized discrimination, and this should link in some ways with like the functionalist perspective for you. This is where a person or a group or even a structure like a bureaucracy in society uses its position in society as a whole as an integral part of committing the act of discrimination that we're talking about. All right. So when we look at isolate discrimination, what this is when a person uses their position within society. Typically, it has to do with a job or a title in order to engage in some sort of discriminatory behavior. So I think, in the news, we see this a lot. In the documentary 13th, we saw this. At least in the United States, I'd say the most well-known example of this has to do with when, an individual, like police officer, engages in some sort of discriminatory behavior using their position of power, racial profiling type actions and behaviors. And there are other examples too. For example, if you are in a job and you are part of like HR, you're making a hiring decision, and you use your title and your power to hire and fire to only hire, or rather to deliberately not hire someone based on their race or ethnicity. That's also an example of isolate discrimination because you're using your title and your position. That's the difference. Individual discrimination is a person, out on the street, so to speak, acting on their own, not using any sort of authority. Isolate involves authority that you have through some sort of, like I said, title or job or position in a bureaucracy or in society. When you look at small group discrimination, this like an example would be like a hate group. All right. The idea is that it's coordinated, right? And that's where it starts to become institutionalized. It's not just some isolated random act. You have people coming together to consciously do something that is discriminatory. Um, Direct and indirect institutionalized are the ones that we're going to look at a little more, though, because these are the trickier ones, particularly indirect. So direct institutionalized discrimination is when a structure within society deliberately creates some sort of system to discriminate. The best example in the United States would be segregation, right? Many states in the United States knowingly passed laws that separated people based on race in an unequal way, right? Direct institutionalized. The government did it. Now, I know there are people within the government, but remember, whenever we talk about some sort of structure, bureaucracy, or whatever, we tend to focus on the structure itself, right? Not the individual people within it. So, these governments created segregation laws. Apartheid in South Africa is a good example of this. Any sort of law that creates a split system based on religion, which tends to be in other parts of the world instead, but same type of thing. So it's some sort of like conscious act to discriminate by a system, right? By a government or a bureaucracy. Most of these are illegal, at least in the United States now. It doesn't mean that they don't happen, but it does mean that technically they are illegal and can be punished. The indirect institutionalized discrimination is the trickier one because this is stuff, think like latent functions, right? Direct institutionalized discrimination is like a manifest function, and indirect institutionalized discrimination is like a latent function. So in indirect institutionalized discrimination, there's a system in place, and what it does is it basically creates conditions that discriminate, albeit unintentionally. All right, it is not necessarily a malicious act, so to speak, and we'll look at those in a second. So let's take a look here. So before we look at the specific examples, just to kind of clarify, though, you saw this in your chapter 10 reading. Whenever we talk about discrimination, obviously we're talking about dominant and subordinate groups. So in all of these cases, the group committing the act of discrimination is the dominant group versus the subordinate. The one thing to really be sure to note here is that dominant does not mean biggest, right? In apartheid South Africa, the white population in South Africa was significantly smaller than the black population. Yet it was the dominant group. So it's whoever has control over power and resources. We're starting to kind of blend in the conflict theory, which we'll actually wrap up with today. So let's look at some examples now. So what we have here are SAT scores, and this is a little bit older. This is when it was on the 2,400 point scale. That's why you're above 1,600. So basically combine the writing SAT. But what you see is that people living in lower socioeconomic groups in the United States, and it's a direct link there. I mean, you see there's every single group increases as you go up in income. But basically, the more money you have, the better you do on your SATs. Now, why is that? And some of this you probably could answer yourself. And obviously, it's the better you do on average. It's not every single person. SATs, as we know, are not just about our own knowledge. They are about how good you are at taking the SAT, right? Half of it is prepping for this specific type of exam. So people take courses, they get tutors, they buy books. All of these are things that the farther up you move in the socioeconomic ladder, the easier it is to do. Someone who is living below the poverty line doesn't have the money to have a private SAT tutor for a year to prep for the test. So what some people will argue is that this is a form of indirect institutionalized discrimination. The SAT wasn't written deliberately to target low-income Americans, but unfortunately, the way it looks is that low-income Americans tend to do worse, which then correlates with things like college admissions and things like that. Now, there are other factors too, obviously. If you have to work another job to help pay for things in the family, if there's, instability at home, there's all sorts of factors that can go into these scores, but the fact that there is such a connection between money and high scores, or at least there's a correlation, I should say, that leads a lot of people to believe that there's indirect institutional discrimination going on, unintentional. Now, if we take a look at this next thing, this is where a lot of this actually began, even before I was in high school. As people started to research how standardized tests were written and composed, the point was brought up that a lot of standardized tests also have bias written into them. And that it's not even necessarily income or things like that, but the tests were written basically for, upper income, middle income people. It wasn't just the preparation. And this is a good example of a question that's been used for many years to show how bias used to be in the SATs. So we used to have to do, when I was in high school, we used to have to do basically these like analogies, or not analogies, but these comparisons where, you've probably seen these before. Runner is to marathon. So which one of these is the same? A runner runs a marathon. So which one of A does B, right? And the correct answer is C. An oarsman competes in a regatta the same way a runner competes in a marathon, right? An oarsman works on a ship. Now here's the issue. The point was brought up that this could have bias in a lot of ways. One is it's biased towards coastal students, not landlocked students. Because if you live in Wyoming, you probably have not competed in a regatta. The other argument is that it also is biased towards middle and especially upper income students because crew, sailing, regattas, like that's expensive. It's also typically not in your average public high school. So even people living on the coasts where they have access to water where these competitions might take place might not have any experience or ever heard of them. If they're not from, an upper income level family. And this is just one example. There's lots of them. For example, I think this one might be a little more easily related to. If the SAT, how the SAT has like passages that have different subjects, science, history, things like that. If the SAT only gave you passages about subjects that you didn't learn about in Metuchen, when you took the SAT, maybe you learned about them, senior year and you took the SAT as a junior. But every other school in America learned about those subjects of the passages freshman and sophomore year. You would be at a competitive disadvantage because those students might be able to pick up information from past knowledge that you wouldn't have. That's why a lot of the SAT passages seem so random, is it's things that are supposed to not give any one person an edge. And that's another example of indirect institutionalized discrimination, is that maybe the test makers weren't deliberately doing this, but based on their background, they might have written a test that was good for someone from their background, but not necessarily another. And it's not just racial and ethnic or economic. It's rural, suburban. It can be all of these different ways that we kind of learn about our society around us. And if the test is written based off of like someone else's living situation, so to speak, it could kind of change things. And what this ultimately leads us to is coming back to the conflict perspective, and this kind of impact that a lot of this has, where what the conflict perspective argues is that both in law and in practice, like the split labor market, we have created a system that institutionally, we, not just even in the United States, in the world, have created a system that either intentionally or unintentionally, depending on the area we're talking about, creates a competitive disadvantage for low-income people. And I say that because it's not just Americans. And racial, ethnic, religious minorities, and also for women. We'll get to that in the next chapter. So all of these are examples that we're looking at. And the split labor market is the one that I want to kind of end on today, because if we take a look, this is what the split labor market looks like in practice, so to speak. So these are stats from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's not like some think tank or partisan group. And what this shows you is the ethnic breakdown of some of the major types of jobs in the United States. And basically, as you work your way from the orange at the top down to the red and the blue at the bottom, you work your way down in salary as well as the perception of prestige of that collection of jobs. And we talked all about prestige, a couple months ago. And what you see is that white, and Asian Americans disproportionately have a larger percentage of the orange and the light blue jobs, which are seen as the highest paying, or are the highest paying, and then seen in a lot of ways as some of the most prestigious jobs. Um, and what the conflict theory would state is that this is the product of, generations of this type of discrimination, both direct and indirect institutional. Um, and what that has now done is created this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So what we'll get into with as we wrap this unit up is you'll be looking at examples of indirect or direct institutional discrimination that you see in society either today or in the past couple of decades. But this is just kind of an intro to it. All right. So this is going to wrap up our look at chapter 10. You're going to be taking a look at this today, Wednesday, and tomorrow, Thursday. This is just your work for the rest of the week. It's the last AP week, so I wanted to kind of go easy. And you'll be off Friday and Monday for Memorial Day weekend. And then on Tuesday when you come back, we will take a look at a little project we're going to do as a way to wrap this up instead of like a test or a quiz. But that's for Tuesday. All right. Hope you guys have a relaxing weekend. If you're watching this on Thursday, and I will talk to you soon.